It's definitely the biggest number we've ever seen. We've been looking at this research for over a decade now.
Chase Horton is a senior analyst at Cerulli Associates, and he's the lead author of a new report quantifying how much wealth in the U.S. will be given out or passed on over the next 2.5 decades. It's a big jump from the number Cerulli found a few years ago, and he thinks he knows why.
It's really a confluence of three trends. Over the past dozen or so years, we've seen a substantial amount of wealth creation. So privately held wealth by households in the United States has increased essentially 100% since we looked at this in 2011, and that's on an inflation-adjusted basis. In addition, we also have seen wealth become increasingly concentrated among fewer wealthier households. And those wealthier households are more likely to be survived by their assets, so they're not going to be spending those assets down like the rest of us. And we've also seen wealth concentration among older households. So more wealth is held today by households that are over the age of 60 than we've seen in a long time. And it's also the highest portion, if you look at the ratio of expected wealth transfer in the next 25 years as a ratio of overall wealth held today, we see about 80% of the wealth held today going to be in motion over the course of the next 25 years. And when we first looked at this about a decade ago, that ratio was closer to 50% of assets in motion. So the ratio of wealth expected to be changing hands in the next 25 years is significant and much greater than what we even saw a decade ago.
More money getting passed down over a relatively short time. And for the 1 in 5 who receive any inheritance at all, the share of their net worth coming from that inheritance, rather than their earned income, is on the rise. A new Bloomberg analysis shows that today, your financial status has more to do with who your parents are than at any time in recent history. That inherited money now accounts for at least a quarter of the wealth for the average inheritor. But many economists think that figure is much higher, including former Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers.
If you count what happens when somebody gets an inheritance and then they invest it and that builds up more wealth, that probably the vast majority, certainly a majority, of the wealth in our economy is related to inheritance. And that's, of course, a complicated thing. On the one hand, family values are good. On the other hand, it's not like it's equally distributed. It's not like it's even as unequally distributed as income. It's not even like it's as unequally distributed as the rest of wealth. It's really very much a phenomenon about a very small fraction of the population.
Given how much wealth is being transferred, one might think we may see a wider distribution of that wealth as well. But don't count on it.
We constantly get asked, will this be redistributive in terms of wealth in the United States? And from what we've seen in the numbers is we don't really think that that's an expectation that people should have. You know, we see a significant amount of the wealth, over 50%, is held by high net worth households, so those that are 10 million or more in net worth, and that makes up around 2% of the population. And we expect a lot of that wealth to go to the top 2% of inheritors. So we don't really see any sort of reason or thing to make us believe that this is going to be, widely distributed beneficially for all Americans.
All that concentrated wealth being passed down echoes what the United States saw back in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, which led President Teddy Roosevelt to call for a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes properly safeguarded against evasion. And Andrew Carnegie, who became the richest man in the world in 1901 when he sold his steel company to John D. Rockefeller, agreed, saying, of all forms of taxation, this seems the wisest. In 1916, Congress enacted the federal estate tax that's been with us in some form or another ever since. But today, that tax doesn't apply to the vast majority of the $105 trillion passing hands.
I think there's a lot of good that's come in this country out of family businesses, family farms, family assets. I do think the extent to which this avoids taxation, even among the very wealthiest people, is something that is very bizarre. Your study estimated that there'll be about $2.5 trillion of wealth passing this year. The collections on the inheritance tax are only going to be about 1% of that $2.5 trillion. Of course, relatively limited inheritances shouldn't get taxed. Of course, you have to treat family farms in appropriate ways. But $2.5 trillion passing, and the vast majority of that being among 5% or 1% of the people who die, and only collecting 1% of it in taxes, I do think we can do better.
There is little reason to expect that the inheritors will pay any more in taxes under the next Trump administration. In his first term, Mr. Trump worked with Congress to cut the number of people subject to the tax to near historic lows, and in campaigning for a second term, advocated eliminating it altogether. But there is one way the great wealth transfer will reduce inequality. Women are set to inherit more money than ever before.
Enormous amounts of this are going to women because first you have to think that men and women have different life expectancies. So first the money goes to the wife.
Emily Green is head of wealth management at Ellevest, a financial firm that focuses on working with women. Wealth advisors, brokers, real estate agents, and others could be well positioned for a windfall as the wealth transfer accelerates in the next few years. And Green says she and her team have seen firsthand the shift from men to women.
And this next generation, millennials and such, there's a lot more single women there have been in prior generations. So there's a lot more women controlling the wealth as this inheritance comes down than there was previously. It's really going to change the way that we invest, spend, give, all these different types of things because women are going to get this huge amount of money.
How far along are we in the process of this wealth transfer?
We're still really early.
Until now, women have gotten a smaller share of inherited wealth than men. But Cerulli estimates that over the next quarter century, Gen Z women will become the first to receive at least half of the country's inheritance. And that, Green says, has major implications for the way that money will be spent and invested in the future.
And you have seen women tend to hire more women. Women tend to give philanthropically. Women tend to invest more in other women. They can give more politically. They can look to make sure that the people in office are reflecting them. You think about businesses, and so the more women can start their own businesses and do these things, that changes society as well. If you look at women business owner numbers, they're great entrepreneurs. If women have the money to create businesses, they can create businesses that serve them. So even think about healthcare. Healthcare, for a long time, drugs were only tested on men. And so when we think about healthcare, if women can create healthcare companies that are focusing on 50% of the population as well, you are changing things. There's a lot of opportunity within these spaces because there's a lot of companies that just aren't focusing on women and how they're actually thinking about this.
An economy that's better suited to fulfill the needs of the whole population rather than just 50% of it is certainly an improvement. But what about the 80% of Americans who don't stand to inherit anything? Will rising inequality weigh on economic dynamism? How much does it matter? Big questions and easy enough to ask. But when it comes to answering them, what's best for the U.S. economy might not be what's best for your family. And one of those will always come first.
Just to push it and get a little personal here, you wrote a paper in 1981. I think you were still a PhD candidate at the time. Now you've had a very successful career, I hope done reasonably well, have a family, have a granddaughter. Have your views changed on the intergenerational transfer of wealth at sort of that late in your career as opposed to at the very beginning?
I think at the very beginning, I didn't really think of it as a personal issue at all. I thought about it as just part of understanding the savings process in the economy. Now I think about wanting to help my children, now that I have a grandchild, help my grandchild, but certainly not to the point where they're not living their own lives professionally and doing their own work is the philosophy that I have. I take advantage of the law as it is written, and I find it troubling that the law affords me as many opportunities to avoid paying taxes in completely legal ways as it does. And I think there are all kinds of changes in the estate tax law that would make that law function in a fairer and more equitable way.
Those changes are unlikely to come soon, if at all. And until they do, the economy may grow more dynastic, forcing us to come to grips with how much of our wealth is truly ours and how much we owe to future generations.